For decades, this case was investigated, reviewed, and then quietly set aside. Files were opened, notes were taken, timelines were drawn, and conclusions were reached. Investigators believed they had done everything possible with the information they had at the time. And then, nothing changed. Years passed. Witnesses moved away. Memories faded. Evidence was boxed, labeled, and placed into storage. This disappearance did not happen in isolation. It did not happen in secrecy. It did not happen in the middle of the night. It happened during an ordinary day, under ordinary circumstances, in a place where people were present and life continued as usual. No clear warning signs, no immediate explanation, no straightforward answers. For a long time, investigators believed the case had reached its natural end. They believed the most important questions had already been asked. They believed the available evidence had already been examined from every possible angle. For decades, nothing changed, until one detail forced investigators to look again. A detail that had been documented but not fully examined. A detail that had been acknowledged but not fully understood. A detail that sat quietly in the case file while years turned into decades. This is not a story about rushed conclusions or careless work. It is a story about how time, limitations, and early assumptions can shape the direction of an investigation, and how one overlooked element can challenge what was once considered settled. In this documentary, you will see the case as it was first presented. You will hear how investigators reconstructed the events. You will learn what questions were asked and which ones were left unanswered. We will walk through the original investigation step by step. We will examine the evidence that fit the narrative at the time, and we will focus closely on the pieces that never fully aligned. You will see how certain conclusions guided every decision that followed. You will understand why alternative possibilities were set aside, and you will learn why this case has continued to trouble investigators long after it was considered inactive. Most importantly, you will hear about the detail that changed how the case is viewed today. A detail that could not be fully understood decades ago. A detail that modern analysis has brought back into focus. This is not about rewriting history. It is about re-examining it with clarity, patience, and the benefit of time. Tonight, we revisit a disappearance that was never fully explained. We revisit the questions that remained unanswered, and we revisit the evidence that may finally help explain why this case has refused to fade away. Cold case solved after 35 years, the evidence that finally broke this case open. Victim, Adams Lawrence. Year of disappearance, 1990. Location, Los Angeles, USA. Status, unsolved for decades. Adams Lawrence was known to the people around him as steady, consistent, and dependable. He was born and raised in Southern California, growing up during a period when Los Angeles was expanding rapidly, drawing families who believed in long-term roots and familiar routines. From an early age, Adams was described as thoughtful and reserved. He was not someone who sought attention. He valued order, reliability, and keeping his commitments. Those traits followed him into adulthood and shaped the life he built. Family was central to Adams Lawrence's world. He maintained close ties with relatives, spoke with them regularly, and rarely missed scheduled visits or calls. Birthdays were remembered. Holidays were planned well in advance. If Adams said he would be somewhere, he arrived on time. By 1990, Adams was firmly established in his career. He held a stable position that required regular hours and consistent attendance. Co-workers described him as reliable and methodical. He was not known for sudden schedule changes or unexplained absences. He kept personal and professional boundaries clear, rarely mixing work with social distractions. His daily routine reflected that same structure. Mornings followed a familiar pattern. Evenings were quiet and predictable. He preferred familiar routes, familiar stores, and familiar places. There was comfort in repetition, and Adams valued that comfort. Friends often noted his habits. He kept careful track of his belongings. He documented expenses. He returned calls. He followed through on plans. There was no indication that Adams was preparing for change or considering a departure from his established life. What made his disappearance so striking was not only that he vanished, but that he vanished without disruption beforehand. There were no reports of emotional distress, no financial trouble, no personal conflicts that suggested he wanted to step away. Everything about Adams Lawrence's life pointed toward continuity, stability, routine, a future that looked much like the present. Which is why when he failed to appear where he was expected, concern did not take long to surface. The morning of Adams Lawrence's disappearance began like many mornings before it. There was nothing about the start of the day that suggested it would end differently. Records indicate that Adams was at his residence early that morning. He followed his usual routine, preparing for the day ahead. Phone records confirm brief calls placed during the morning hours, routine conversations that offered no indication of urgency or concern. He was seen leaving his home at a time consistent with his regular schedule. Neighbors later reported nothing unusual. No raised voices, no signs of distress, just another person heading into the day. By mid-morning, Adams had reached a location he visited frequently. Receipts recovered later would help establish this part of the timeline. The transactions were ordinary, matching his past spending habits. There were no unusual items, no deviations from his normal spending patterns. Witnesses at one location recalled brief, unremarkable interactions. Adams appeared calm, focused, engaged in routine tasks. Nothing about his demeanor stood out. As the afternoon progressed, Adams continued moving through familiar places. Phone activity shows brief check-ins, consistent with his habit of staying reachable. There were no missed calls at this stage, no unanswered messages. A receipt time-stamped in the early afternoon placed Adams at a location he visited regularly. The clerk later described him as polite and composed. He was dressed appropriately for the day, wearing clothing typical of his work and personal style. By late afternoon, Adams was expected to be at another scheduled location. This appointment was part of his routine. It was something he rarely missed. The final confirmed sighting occurred shortly after that time. A witness placed Adams near a familiar route he often traveled. The time was documented, the location confirmed. His clothing matched earlier descriptions. The witness noted nothing unusual about his behavior. He was walking at a normal pace. His posture was relaxed. There were no visible signs of concern or distraction. And then the routine ended. Adams did not arrive at his next destination. Calls went unanswered. Appointments were missed. For someone whose life followed clear patterns, the absence was immediate and alarming. There was no message explaining a delay, no call requesting time, no indication that plans had changed. By evening, concern turned into urgency. The timeline that had once been so reliable now contained a gap that could not be easily explained.
That gap would become the focus of every investigation that followed, and it would remain unresolved for decades.
Up to this point, every part of Adams Lawrence's day followed a pattern that those close to him recognized immediately. There were expectations built on years of consistency. There were appointments written down. There were places he was supposed to be at specific times without exception. And then those expectations were not met. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. Adams failed to arrive at a scheduled commitment later that afternoon. This was not a casual meeting. It was something tied directly to his routine, something he had never missed without explanation. At first, the delay did not cause alarm. Traffic in Los Angeles was common. Short delays happened. But minutes turned into more time. Calls were placed. There was no answer. Messages were left, calm at first, then increasingly concerned. Still, no response. By early evening, the contrast between what should have happened and what actually happened became impossible to ignore. Expected, Adams arrives at his scheduled location. He checks in. He completes the task. He returns home at his usual time. Actual, Adams does not arrive. He does not call. He does not respond. Phone records show that after a certain point in the afternoon, his device stopped registering activity. No outgoing calls, no answered messages, no explanation. For someone who was always reachable, the silence was immediate and striking. Family members attempted to retrace his day. They reviewed his schedule. They checked familiar locations. They followed the routes he normally used. Nothing appeared out of place. As evening turned into night, concern grew steadily. This was not a late return. This was not a forgotten obligation. This was absence. By the next morning, it was clear that something had interrupted Adams Lawrence's routine in a way no one had anticipated. That realization marked the moment everything changed. The disappearance of Adams Lawrence was reported by a family member who understood his habits better than anyone else. They knew how consistent he was. They knew how carefully he managed his time. And they knew that his silence was not normal. Law enforcement responded and began by establishing the last confirmed points in Adams's timeline. Officers spoke with family members, co-workers, and anyone who had interacted with him that day. The early focus was routine verification, where he had been seen, who had spoken to him, what could be confirmed with records. Initial assumptions reflected the information available at the time. Investigators considered the possibility of a delay, a misunderstanding, or a voluntary absence. There was no immediate evidence suggesting otherwise. As the investigation progressed, physical items connected to Adams were documented. Personal belongings left behind were noted. His residence showed no signs of disruption. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place. Statements were taken carefully. Witnesses described interactions that were ordinary and brief. No one recalled raised voices or unusual behavior. No one reported seeing Adams in distress. Early forensic efforts were limited by the tools and practices available at the time. Evidence was processed according to standard procedures of the early 1990s. Records were collected, files were assembled. As news of the disappearance spread, the community responded. Family members organized search efforts. Friends volunteered time. Flyers were distributed. Local media reported the facts as they were known. A missing person, a stable life, no clear explanation. For days, then weeks, Adams Lawrence's name remained in the public eye. Tips came in. Leads were followed. Each one ended without resolution. As time passed, attention shifted. New cases emerged, resources were redirected. What remained was a case file filled with careful notes, unanswered questions, and a timeline that ended abruptly. And with that, Adams Lawrence's disappearance entered a new phase, one defined not by activity, but by waiting. As the weeks following Adams Lawrence's disappearance turned into months and then years, certain questions refused to settle. They were not traumatic questions, they were practical ones. Quiet questions rooted in timelines, records, and human behavior. The first issue investigators returned to repeatedly was the timeline. On paper, Adams's day appeared well documented. There were confirmed sightings, receipts with timestamps, phone records showing activity up to a specific point. But between those confirmed moments, gaps remained. Minutes that could not be fully accounted for, short windows where Adams's location could not be verified with certainty, periods that seemed insignificant at first, but later became increasingly important. One such gap involved the late afternoon hours. Investigators knew where Adams had been earlier in the day. They knew where he was expected to be later. What they could not determine with confidence was how he moved between those points during that final stretch. Witness statements added another layer of uncertainty. Some individuals recalled seeing someone matching Adams's description at locations that aligned with the timeline. Others remembered a similar figure at slightly different times or places. None of these accounts were intentionally misleading. They reflected how memory works, especially when events seem ordinary at the time. But when those statements were placed side by side, small differences emerged. A time remembered as early afternoon by one witness appeared closer to evening in another account. A location described as nearby varied by several blocks depending on who was speaking. These differences were noted, but early conclusions led investigators to prioritize certain statements over others. Once a working narrative formed, information that did not fit neatly was often set aside rather than fully explored. Evidence collection also raised lingering concerns. Some items were documented later than ideal. Some potential sources of information were never fully examined. Certain locations were revisited only after time had passed, limiting what could be recovered. None of these actions were unusual for the period. They reflected the standards and limitations of the time, but they mattered. Perhaps the most lasting issue was how assumptions gradually became treated as established facts. Early in the investigation, it was believed that Adams had likely followed his usual route. That belief guided search efforts, it shaped interviews, it influenced which leads were considered more credible than others. Once that assumption settled in, alternative possibilities received less attention, not because they were impossible, but because they seemed less likely within the framework that had already been built. Over time, the questions remained. Why did Adams leave behind items he always carried? Why was there no confirmed interaction during a time when he was usually in contact with others? Why did certain small details fail to align, even years later? These questions never produced immediate answers, but they never disappeared either. They lingered quietly in the case file, waiting. As the time moved forward, the pace of the investigation slowed. Active searches ended, leads became less frequent. The case shifted from daily attention to periodic review. For Adams Lawrence's family, the waiting did not ease. Days without answers became years filled with uncertainty. Each phone call carried hope. Each passing milestone carried absence. They continued to ask questions. They continued to revisit memories. They continued to wonder whether something had been missed. Within law enforcement, personnel changes occurred. Detectives who had worked the case moved on to other assignments. Some retired, others transferred. With each transition, knowledge was passed down through files and summaries, but details that lived only in memory became harder to preserve. Evidence was carefully archived, boxes were labeled, reports were stored according to procedure. But time affects more than paper. Witnesses aged, some moved away, others struggled to recall details that once seemed clear.
What had been an ordinary afternoon decades ago became difficult to reconstruct with precision. Opportunities narrowed as time passed. Technologies that did not exist in 1990 could not be applied then. Methods that are standard today were unavailable at the time. The case was not forgotten. It remained open, but it rested quietly. The silence was not the result of indifference. It was the result of time moving forward while answers stayed behind. And as the years continued, one truth became increasingly clear. Every unanswered question carried a cost. Every delay made resolution more difficult. Yet, despite the passage of time, the case never fully closed. Because unanswered questions have a way of waiting patiently for the moment when someone looks at them again with fresh eyes.
As the case of Adams Lawrence moved further into history, one thing became clear. Answers did not disappear. They simply changed shape. Over the years, several explanations emerged. Each one attempted to account for what was known, what was missing, and what could not be explained. None offered complete resolution, but each revealed something important about how the case had been understood at different moments in time. Theory 1. The official conclusion. According to investigators at the time, the most reasonable explanation was built on routine. Police believed Adams followed his normal pattern that day. They believed nothing indicated immediate danger. They believed his disappearance occurred within a narrow window when no witnesses were present. Supporting facts appeared to reinforce this view. There were no signs of disruption at his last known location, no confirmed reports of conflict, no clear indication of preparation to leave his life behind. From an investigative standpoint in 1990, this explanation aligned with the information available. However, certain elements never fit comfortably within that framework. Items Adams typically kept with him were left behind. Expected follow-up actions never occurred, and the lack of confirmed sightings after a specific time remained difficult to explain. Even within official records, notes reflected unanswered concerns, questions acknowledged but unresolved, details marked for later review that never received full attention. The conclusion stood, but with quiet gaps. Theory 2. The family's belief. For Adams's family, the official explanation never felt complete. They knew his routines. They knew his habits. They knew how consistent his behavior had been over many years. Their doubts centered on one key point. Adams did not simply disappear from his responsibilities. He did not miss commitments without notice. He did not ignore communication. He did not leave matters unfinished. The family believed certain details were overlooked too quickly. They felt some witness statements were accepted without deeper examination. They believed assumptions about Adams's choices were made without fully understanding his character. They questioned why alternative possibilities were set aside early. Their perspective was not based on speculation. It was based on familiarity, on patterns built over decades, and that belief never changed. Years later, journalists and retired detectives began reviewing the case with fresh distance. Some researchers noticed similarities between Adams's timeline and other unresolved cases from the same period. Not identical circumstances, but shared patterns. Short windows of absence, limited witness coverage, critical moments occurring in routine environments. Retired investigators noted how early conclusions can shape the direction of an entire case. Once a theory gains traction, later information is often interpreted through that lens. Journalists revisiting archived reports highlighted details that received little attention at the time. Minor inconsistencies, brief mentions in police notes, statements that were never followed up.
According to these researchers, the case may not have lacked information, it may have lacked reevaluation. Theory 4. Modern forensic thinking. With advancements in technology, new possibilities emerged. DNA analysis, now far more sensitive than in 1990, offered the potential to re-examine preserved evidence. Items once considered uninformative could now carry significance. Behavioral analysis also evolved. Modern profiling looks closely at decision points, environmental context, and deviation from routine. Digital reconstruction tools allow investigators to rebuild timelines with greater precision. Traffic patterns, communication gaps, movement possibilities. According to modern forensic specialists, cases like Adams-Lawrence's are often limited not by facts, but by the era in which they were first examined. Each theory carries weight. Each explains part of the story. None explains all of it. For decades, the case remained largely unchanged until one detail returned to focus. It was not new evidence. It was not a confession. It was something that had been there all along. A record. At the time, it was considered routine, filed, acknowledged, then set aside. The record involved timing, a small discrepancy that seemed insignificant when first reviewed. Alongside it was a witness statement that was never revisited. The individual was cooperative, their account was documented, but no follow-up interview occurred. There was also a test that simply did not exist in 1990. No method at the time could extract meaningful information from the material involved. Individually, these details appeared minor. Together, they mattered. When reviewed using modern tools, the record altered the established timeline. It suggested Adams may have been in a different location than originally believed, or at a different time. That shift challenged earlier assumptions. It raised new questions about who might have been nearby, what routes were possible, which statements needed re-examination. Experts reviewing the case later explained why this detail went unnoticed. At the time, investigators were working within technological and procedural limits. They prioritized the most immediate explanations. They focused on what could be confirmed quickly. Today, that same detail carries greater weight. According to specialists, it reframes the final known moments of Adams-Lawrence's day. It does not provide an answer, but it changes the question. And sometimes, that's where progress begins. Because when one overlooked detail is finally seen clearly, everything that came before it must be looked at again. Today, the case of Adams-Lawrence remains open. It has not been closed by arrest. It has not been resolved by confirmed explanation. It exists in official records as unresolved. Over the years, the file has been reviewed more than once. Each review has brought renewed attention, followed by careful reassessment of what can and cannot be stated as fact. According to current law enforcement records, no individual has been formally charged in connection with Adams-Lawrence's disappearance. No verified location has been identified as the place where he was last present beyond the final confirmed sighting already documented. Some investigative steps have been revisited. Archived materials were examined using updated methods. Certain witness accounts were reread with modern analytical standards in mind. However, authorities have also been clear about the limits. There is no confirmed evidence that establishes exactly what happened after Adams-Lawrence was last seen. There is no verified sequence of events beyond that point. There is no definitive explanation that accounts for every missing detail. What is confirmed remains narrow and precise. Adams-Lawrence was last seen in Los Angeles in 1990. His routine on the day of his disappearance followed familiar patterns. Key personal items were not recovered. No confirmed communication occurred after a specific time. What remains uncertain is everything beyond that moment. Investigators have acknowledged that unanswered questions still exist. They have also stated that any new information, no matter how small, could be significant. The case stands exactly where it has stood for decades, between what is known and what has never been fully explained. Cases like this are shaped not only by evidence, but by memory. People remember moments. They remember details that once seemed unimportant. They remember things they didn't realize mattered at the time. So the question remains, after all these years, is the truth missing, or has it simply remained unspoken? If you value careful, respectful examinations of unresolved cases, you're welcome to subscribe for future investigations. New stories, new perspectives, and continued attention to cases that still deserve answers. Thank you for listening.